Hey guys, it's Makeshift, and today I'm going to show you how to pattern and sew simple ear folds like this. So this is a cat plush and he has very simple triangular ears, and rather than just have a simple triangle pattern piece, I did a little bit extra by patterning this 3D fold into the ear. So instead of just having plain old triangles that stick out of the top of his head, I added a little bit of dimension to this ear pattern just to make it pop a little bit more. It's a pretty simple technique as long as your ear is shaped in a simple way like this cat here, and it's easy to pattern and sew as well. I machine sew them into the head seam of the plush, but you could also hand stitch them on if you'd like to. So let's go ahead and get started. So the first thing I do is print out a picture of the ear that I want to make to scale with my plush. And if you don't have a printer, that's okay. You can just draw it out to scale however big you want it to be. And so the ultimate goal here is to fold the fabric in on itself to create this little fold here in the ear. Rather have this be one flat pattern piece. We want to give it a little bit of dimension and look a little 3D by having this ear fold right here. So I have one of my ear pieces here, and you can see that if I fold this on itself, it makes this nice 3D ear fold that aligns with this ear down here. So to get that fold into my pattern, it's pretty simple. I just start by tracing the outline of the ear itself, and you can add seam allowance at this point, or you cannot add seam allowance. In this video I'm not going to add my seam allowance just yet, but I've also done it where I've had the seam allowance out here on the edges of my ear, but it really doesn't matter either way. You can add it later on to your pattern. For the area where it meets the head, you want it to curve into the ear because your head is going to be generally round. And so if you curved your ear outward, it's going to join a little strangely onto the head. So you want to maintain this inward curve into the ear. And if your plush has a strangely shaped head that doesn't line up with your ear image, you could even trace the shape of your plush onto the paper if you had your plush or a test plush made. So this is my test plush. I could just trace around the shape of this head if I needed to, but since it's just a general round shape, just tracing this curve here is fine. So this would make a fine plain 2D ear, but we want to have a fold in this area. So what you want to do is just generally sketch out some extra room here beyond the edge of where you want the fold to be. So the fold is here, so I'm just going to draw out some extra room. It doesn't matter how much. You don't want it to be too small because then you might have to add more paper, but this is rather big here and I won't need that much more in the end, but I can easily trim it down, whereas I can't as easily add more paper. And I'm also going to add some more down here because I am going to fold this onto itself, so I just want to make sure that I get this shape correctly. So now I'm going to go ahead and cut out around this line that I've drawn. So now you want to fold this piece of paper on the line that the edge of the ear makes. So I want my ear to fold right along this line. And I'm going to fold it on top of this pattern piece the way I would want it to work in the fabric. And sometimes it helps if you do the opposite, just so you can see your line and then you can flip it the opposite way afterward. Okay, so we have the beginnings of the pattern, but you can see it's quite a mess because of all that extra paper that I have on. So you can start by flipping it to the other side and then trimming off the extra above it. And then you can also trim off the extra beneath it. So now it's much cleaner, but the ear fold itself is not the shape that I want it to be. So we just have to take a peek underneath this paper to see where the ear fold ends. And you can see that's right here. So I'm just going to trace on top and peeking at the other end. Ends about here. And so I'm just going to complete this line. So now you can cut along this line. Alright, so then you have the beginnings of your ear fold. And if we unfold this, you can see how this is a somewhat strange shape, which is why I always prefer doing this method where I draw it out and then fold it over, retrace the ear, and then cut it down to the size I need to, just because my brain's not really smart enough to make this shape on my own. And this way I can also make sure that it matches up on the piece that I want to make exactly. So now from here we can go ahead and add our seam allowance to the edges. I always use a 1/4 inch seam allowance, but you can use whatever you're comfortable with, or if you don't like using seam allowance, that's fine too. You can also go ahead and add any additional colors that you need to. So for example, this ear is going to have a pink inside. So on my ear, even though this is the reverse, the inside of my ear is pink surrounded by this cream color here. So I just went ahead and did my color blocking technique, which you can watch another one of my videos on, to make the inside of this ear pink. So you want to preserve this ear shape pattern as well, because the back of your ear, unless you're also going to color block that, is going to be this complete shape. But once you start color blocking it, if you cut apart your original pattern, then you're going to have to either tape it back together or redo it. So one thing you want to keep in mind with the inside of the ear is that even though you might be tempted to make this big area here all pink, it might start to end up coming out on the inward curve here. So me personally, I would want this to stay the color of the outside of the ear. So I can show you one that I messed up on and did that. So you can see the difference here in how I color blocked both of these ears. This one just went out way too far. So when I fold this, you can see how the pink eats into the outside color of the ear, and that was just from poor planning with how this ear folds. So on my next attempt, I just cut down the size of this triangle on the inside so that when I fold it, it is just a cream color on the outside. The one thing I will say about this method is that you are somewhat limited on the shape you can get with the side of the ear that you're curling. So you can see here how it forms a straight line, and this simple method is always going to result in a straight line. You could add a little dart along the bottom here where it would be very small so that it would just curve this bottom piece inward a bit. So it would, instead of being a straight line, it would end up curving just a small little bit. And there are lots of tutorials out there on how to add darts to your pattern, and I don't have one yet that I can advertise, but again, this is kind of advanced pattern making, so I won't go over it in this video, but if you did want to have a more rounded ear shape, then you can't really get that with this method because you are just folding fabric in on itself. So once you get your seam allowance added to your pattern piece, or if you choose not to, you'll end up with something like this. Once you get your pattern made and you do any other additional patterning, like adding a color transition via color blocking or applique or whatever method you choose, you can go ahead and sew your ear together. I have my two pieces here. They are mirrored, of course, because we're going to be sewing them with right sides together, and right side is the pretty side. Now, if you had a character with a thicker ear style, you could add some dimension by adding a layer of quilt batting as a lining piece. You can check out my video on how to add dimension to 2D plush pieces. This would be a really good video to add some extra dimension to your ears if you wanted to have something bigger and something a little bit thicker than what I have here. Since this is a cat, I want to keep the ears thin, so I'm not going to be adding any quilt batting as a lining piece, but if this is a style that would interest you, I recommend checking out my video that I will link. So once you're ready to sew them together, you just flip it over and place it with right sides together. I'm going to sew on this side just so I can see this color block transition here. I did trim my seam allowance, and I don't always do this with my plushies because I use a 1/4 inch, so that's already pretty small. But since these ears are very small, I don't want to add any additional bulk to the piece itself because I want these ears to remain thin. So I'm just going to pin along the edge. And now I'm going to sew along this edge here. I'm going to use a normal straight stitch with a normal length. I am not going to sew along this bottom edge here because this is where I'm going to turn it right side out. And I'm also specifically not even going to sew along this edge here, which is the part that flips over, because if I did, then this edge would be a little bit shorter than this edge. So when I went to go flip it over, then this is going to be missing a 1/4 inch along the bottom. So I'm just going to sew along this edge over here. So I have it sewn together, very simple, easy to do. And now I'm just going to trim this seam allowance because again, I want to keep this piece nice and thin, and because we have a point here, you also want to trim it so that you can get that point very nice and defined. And you can use one of these point turner tools to push out the tip of the ear if you want, or you can just use whatever tool you want. Alright, so now it's sewn together, and so we have to go ahead and put the fold into the piece. So I'm personally going to be sewing this ear into the head seam of my plush, and because of that, I'm going to baste the bottom of this ear so that these two sides stick together, because it shifts around a lot if you don't attach them together, and I want it to be nice and clean when I get them into the head seam because I don't want any movement while I'm sewing it together. If you are going to hand sew this onto your plush, you should finish off this edge for sure by either flipping it to where you tuck in the seam allowance, something like this, and then ladder stitching the edges together so that you don't have this raw edge while you're hand sewing it onto your plush. And then once you finish that up, you can go ahead and fold it over to get that folded look. But since I'm going to be hiding this raw edge in the head seam, I'm going to start by basting together this bottom area. And I'm just going to line up the bottom pattern pieces And it might not be exact because I did this color blocking, so these are two different pattern pieces now, the front and the back, so they might not line up exactly. And that's okay, as long as you don't have any huge size differences in your pattern piece. It'll all get captured in the head seam. So now I'm just going to do a basting stitch along this raw edge here. And a basting stitch is just a longer stitch, and that's just so if I make a mistake it's easier to seam rip it out other than just using a normal stitch length. And I want to do the basting stitch inside where my seam allowance will be. So I have a 1/4 inch seam allowance which will run just along here. So I just want to do my basting stitch inside of my seam allowance because I do not want this basting stitch to appear when I get it sewn into the head. So here it is with the basting stitch. You can see this little stitch line that I've done here. It's within a 1/4 inch of the bottom of the ear. So now I can go ahead and fold this ear over to how I want the fold to look. And this should be pretty easy because of this weird pattern shape we have. You just fold it over along this point here to where the bottoms will meet up along the edge. So once you fold it, you can pin it in place. And now you can do one more basting stitch along the bottom to tack this into place. So with this tacked together, now you don't have to worry about it shifting around when you're sewing it into your headpiece. You can see the nice 3D look you get with this fold, like having this little inside area you can peek into. So now we can go ahead and get it attached to our head pattern so that we can sew it together with our head. So with one ear complete, you can go ahead and finish your other ear. And as far as attaching this to the head goes, there are many different ways you can do this. Like I mentioned earlier, you can certainly hand sew this onto your plush, but the way that you finish the bottom of it is probably going to need to be a little bit different to keep it clean. The most common thing I do is insert the ear into the seam line around the side of the head of my plush. So it's very easy to take this pattern that we made and have it line up with the edges of your head, because we did trace around how the side of the head looks. And this is going to be a little bit difficult to pin together because you are attaching a concave curve to a convex curve, so it'll take a little bit of extra pinning and you might run into a situation where you don't catch all of the ear seam. But just be careful about the way you sew it. But it is a very clean and relatively easy way to sew the ear into your head, and it does save time because you're going to be sewing this head seam anyway. So if you insert the ear into that head seam, you don't have to do the additional step of hand sewing it, which I don't like because it takes so long. Also, because this plush is going to have a large hat that's going to go on the back of it, and so if I chose to do something else like create a curved seam for this ear like this, where the ear met the head at a curved angle, where I could use my method of attaching appendages to figure out that pattern, it might interrupt the way that this hat is going to sit on the back of this head. So I don't really want to take up any more real estate on the back of this plush's head because that hat is going to be very large. So I'm just going to sew this into the seam of my head, nice and simple and nothing too complicated. So here's my front head pattern piece, and I have it to the point of where I'm ready to attach the back and sew along the outer edge of this pattern piece. On the back, I've marked the area where I want the ear to begin. So I need to line up the front of the ear with these marks here. And I did that by, when I made my test plush, I just place where I wanted the ear to be, I marked that onto the plush itself, and then when I took it apart for the pattern, I just marked that onto the pattern itself. You don't have to do this if you are familiar enough with your pattern. It probably can be easy enough to guess where you want your ears to be placed. And if you do a basting stitch along the outside first, and then you could stuff it and see how it looks. If you don't like how it looks, then you could just seam rip it apart and reposition them. Also, if they come out uneven, that's also a good reason why to do a basting stitch first. And then if you like how it looks, you can go ahead and finish up that seam with a normal length stitch. So I have both of my ears now, and they're 2 different colors, but I'm going to pin the front facing side to the front of the head. So we want the ear to be like this. So we're gonna flip it over so that these right sides are together. And then we want the front of the ear to line up with this mark that I've made. And this is where you're going to be sewing opposing curves to each other. So you have this shaped curve that's going to be attached to this outward facing curve, and my recommendation here is just to use a lot of pins because these are going to be kind of fighting each other to come together. And you might say, well, I should just make this ear pattern be shaped outward as well, but then you're going to have extra bulky fabric here that when you stuff it all together, it's not going to look good. It's going to kind of bulge out from the head instead of lying nice and cleanly and flat along the curve of the head. So looking at my mark back here, I'm going to line up the front of the ear and I'm going to pin it in place. And now I'm just going to line up the edges and pin along the way. And so with this very pointy end here, I'm going to stick it out pretty far past the head pattern because this is just extra fabric in the seam allowance and I don't really want it to point out all the way. And so now I have this pinned together and I'm going to do the same thing with the other side. So again, this is the side we want facing forward. So we flip it onto the head, find the line, and line it up with the edge of the ear. Pin it in place. And here you can double check with the tape measure to make sure that your length is the same. So I'm going to measure from the middle head seam to the beginning of the ear. So this is 1 3/8. So 1 3/8 would be here, which means I'm pretty far past. I need to adjust this forward a bit. And that looks better. So now I'm going to pin the rest of the ear. Okay. So the next thing I like to do is to baste this ear onto this head seam. So similar to how we basted the fold into place, I like to baste this ear into place first so that when I'm sewing this head together, if I went ahead and put the back piece on and then sewed that all together, I have just a greater chance of something shifting in all this and coming out uneven. And if I did make these ears crooked in this seam, in this pinning process, I would rather not have that back piece on here to deal with as well. So to me, it's worth the little bit of extra effort of doing another basting stitch right along the edge here. So again, it's going to be very similar to what we did with the basting the edge of this ear, where I'm just going to do a long stitch right along the edge of these two pattern pieces within my seam allowance, so not beyond 1/4 inch, just so that I can tack them together so that nothing will shift around when I'm sewing this final headpiece together. So I have the ears basted onto the head pattern. If I flip it over, you can see the stitch marks. They are nice and long, and you can see how close they are to the edge. So when I do my 1/4 inch seam allowance, I'm not going to capture any of those basting stitches beyond it, so it won't show up on the right side of the fabric. If any of them do peek through when you go ahead and sew it together, since they are a basting stitch, it's very easy to take them out because they are so long and loose. So if I flip them out just to get a preview of what they look like, you can see they're nice and even. The length between the middle head seam and where the ears start looks even to me. They both end right here at this side dart here. So I'm happy with how they look, and I'm going to go ahead and get the back pattern piece and pin this together so we can finish up the head. So here's my back of the head, and now I'm going to pin this together. I'm going to flip it to the right side facing inward. I'm going to fold the ears inward as well, and I'm going to pin the top head seam together and start going down. And so you want to make sure that your ear is still in place, which it should be because we basted it together, but it's always good to double check that it's folded into the pattern so that you won't accidentally be sewing anything you don't want to. And it's also good to make sure that it's lying flat as well, that there are no folds or puckers. I have a color transition here to line up. So I'm just going to make sure that is aligned. If you guys need help aligning your color transitions, I do have a video on that as well that you can watch. Okay, now I'm going to flip to the other side. Alright, so now I'm all pinned up. So I'm going to sew along my pinned edge. I'm going to do my 1/4 inch seam allowance. And on the back, I shouldn't have any issue with catching these basting stitches in my 1/4 inch seam allowance. I am going to do a basting stitch, so I'm going to do a long stitch just so that I make sure that my ears are properly caught in my head seam. And then I'll check to make sure everything looks okay, and if I like it, then I'll go ahead and go over the basting stitch with a normal length stitch. Okay, so I have my head seam stitched. You can see how the stitch line is beyond the basting stitch we did, so it won't show up when I flip this right side out. So let's take a look. Alright, so you can see that the seam looks clean. Not seeing any of the basting stitches here. I do have some pink thread coming up, but this I think is actually from my embroidery when I trace the shape of the head. So that's an easy trim. Not seeing any stitches back here either. On this ear, looks to be the same case. And on the back, the edges are not popping out, which is another thing that can happen as well. And there's no raw edges shown. The fold is still nice and in place here and defined, and they look even. So I'm happy with this. I think I'm going to go ahead and finish up the head by going over my basting stitches with a shorter stitch length so that I can get it all finished up and we can take a look. And so here's the finished head. The ears are nice and even on both sides. They have a nice little fold in them, which adds a little bit more interest and dimension to them if they were just plain triangles sticking out of the side of the head. And the way that we sewed the ears into the head seam is nice and clean. It's very sturdy, so there's no risk of them popping off of the head over time. So I'm very happy with how these came out, and hopefully you guys can use this technique in one of your plushies in the future, and I'd love to see what you make if you decide to do so. And thanks for watching, everyone, and see you next time. Bye bye.